The cyberpunk genre is filled with cautionary tales of dystopia, from Robocop to Total Recall, and beloved 90s video games like Flashback. And more modern games like Deus Ex, and of course the quintessential 80s cyberpunk movie Blade Runner. Posing important moral, economic and philosophical questions that are more relevant today than ever. As we face a world of increased inequality, invasive technology and corporate control. Cyberpunk 2077 also succeeds brilliantly in doing just that. An expansive universe with so much detail that it struggles on even the latest generation of hardware at the highest settings. The game had a controversial launch because of the bugs and poor performance on old hardware, but it's still been received by many as one of the best representations of the genre and aesthetic, with a dedicated modding community emerging just days after its release. The main criticism seems to be that the game tries to do too much, being compared to a mixture of a Bulletstorm shooter, a Deus Ex stealth, and a GTA-style open world. With such a large scope, it's not surprising that the developers struggled to have a release product on time for Christmas, but with user mods and developer updates sure to come for many years, and with even a rumoured online multiplayer mode, this game is sure to have a place in the hearts of people like me for many years to come. The cultural and economic significance is also too important to ignore. The game being released as we enter a new decade pushes us into a new generation of graphical hardware and a new political landscape, post-Brexit, post-Trump, and recovering from a pandemic that caused mass deaths, job losses, and further consolidation of wealth towards the top. Where possible, I've tried to avoid most major plotline spoilers, but I will be using important scenes from the game, so beware. I'll be presenting universe-building facts and backstory, and I'll look at the history of what led up to the point where our timelines diverged. And then we'll consider how we might also resist the Mega-Corp. Johnny Silverhand, played by Keanu Reeves, is the co-protagonist of the game. He's the notorious anti-capitalist terrorist, or freedom fighter, depending on your perspective, and how you choose to play the game. Silverhand was killed in 2023 after attacking the headquarters of the Arasaka Mega-Corp with a mini-nuclear weapon. However, a digital copy of his brain and persona, known as an engram, is somehow captured and saved by Arasaka. Why on earth they would want to keep a digital copy of their biggest nemesis is beyond me. Johnny Silverhand was part of a subculture which was popular in the early part of the 21st century. Known as rocker boys, they create art that speaks to the people in a rallying cry against the mega corporations. Now trapped inside the mind of V, the main protagonist, who you play in the game, Johnny is a narcissistic arsehole. His motivations seem questionable, but in many ways he shows his compassion and mutual respect. Johnny's persona is slowly consuming you as he takes over the mind and body of the character V. You face the hard choice of whether to help him in his radical goals and ultimately concede full control of your body to him. As you begin to understand his deeper motivations and reasons for his past actions,
tell you why I want to destroy Arasaka, but I'll only tell you once. Want to hear it?
All right.
I saw a corpse strip farmers of water, and eventually of land. Saw them transform Night City into a machine fueled by people's crushed spirits, broken dreams, and emptied pockets. Corps have long controlled our lives, taken lots, and now they're after our souls.
Might be right. Can't really argue with you there.
V, I've declared war not because capitalism's a thorn in my side or out of nostalgia for an America gone by. This war's a people's war against a system that spiraled out of our control. It's a war against the fucking forces of entropy. Understand?
And?
Got static. Say something, Bug.
The greatest crimes issue from a desire for excess and not from necessity.
Say what now?
Aristotle. Guess you read me then.
Yeah, I read you. Not so much your Greek friend, though it was kind of exciting.
Could give it some thought. Try to understand.
The mega-corporations' influence became so powerful, they dwarfed that of national governments. Wars are now fought directly by corporations themselves against each other in a struggle for control. This world is a depiction of what an anarcho-capitalist or libertarian world might look like. Total corporate control, minimal to no government intervention or regulation. In the accelerated alternative universe of Cyberpunk, which began to diverge from ours in major ways in the 1980s, there have been 4 corporate wars leading up to the world of 2077. This corporatocracy began to emerge after the fall of the United States of America, and national governments began to lose control of corporations. The reason for the fall of America was because of the greed and corruption of what is known in cyberpunk lore as the Gang of Four, a political cabal comprised of 4 of America's biggest alphabet soup agencies, the NSA, CIA, FBI, and DEA. The Gang of Four amassed so much political and military influence, with no congressional oversight, that their power grew unchecked in size and scope, acquiring near limitless influence in government, military, and financial circles. The Gang of Four would engage in espionage and stock market manipulation in an attempt to undermine their global rivals' influence and power. Until finally, the gang was exposed for their corruption in a global scandal so big that it ultimately led to the decline of the US dollar as the world reserve currency. In its place would emerge a currency known as the Eurodollar, known in the game as eddies. If you start the game with the Corpo life path, you're presented with a totally different view of Night City from the very beginning compared to the other 2. You enter a world which immediately exposes you to espionage, bribery and corruption.
Authorization granted.
Are you online? Have a seat, V. Be right with you. We have to handle this voting issue before we lose our bases in the sea of clouds. They're about to begin. What's the situation? You know what to do. Start now. Director Abernathy.
I watched the vote. What the hell was that?
A deep clean after the shit Frankfurt dumped on us. As we agreed, I got rid of the problem.
I told you to resolve the problem, not massacre the European Space Council. Do you understand what the cover-up will cost?
We would have lost the license. Now we gained a week. That's a win.
You travel to the second location after starting the game in a luxury flying car with champagne and a stunning view. Night City itself, the fictional location which the game is set, was originally conceived and built by a man named Richard Knight in the 90s. He wanted to create a city free from stifling regulations of governments, meaning low taxes and a council run by the corporations themselves. As expected in the glamorous and grimy 2077 version of Night City, crime and corruption are rife. there's a sense of hopelessness, nihilism and despair. Seen all throughout the city in advertising is a hyper-commodification of sex and everything else. If anything goes, nothing changes. In a city where you're seen as a terrorist for advocating for workers' unions or higher taxes on the rich.
Hello and welcome to WNS News. I'm Arif Iqbal. Today we have several important public service announcements. In Arroyo, a terrorist group dubbing itself a trade union has been eradicated. These self-proclaimed representatives of Night City's working class attempted to organize a strike which could have led to financial losses in the millions. Remember, if you come across these so-called union representatives, immediately contact the NCPD or the appropriate corporate security forces.
A city where even the police complain about how Mega-Corps consume smaller businesses to increase their monopoly power. So how do we go about resisting the Mega-Corp? To find out, we need to see how we got here and how corporate power has in fact increased and then been resisted and restrained in the past. The first corporations were born in the 17th century when European monarchs chartered them for specific public reasons to exist. This was typically trade, infrastructure and production. Corporations limited the liability of investors. This helped make riskier and larger scale projects more viable, like sailing to new lands, for the investors and for the monarchs of each country. The corporations helped spread large-scale international trading networks with the colonies in the New World. The USA was in fact conceived by a corporation, the Massachusetts Bay Corporation, which was chartered by King Charles I. The American Revolution was not only to free the colonies from the rule of monarch, but also to free themselves from the power of the corporation. Members of the Boston Tea Party were resisting the British East India Company's monopoly power. After the Revolution, the US government and states themselves chartered their own corporations to form specific public works, like railroads and water supplies. The type of consolidation of power by a few corporations, as seen in Cyberpunk, has in fact happened before in history. The economic historian Karl Polanyi argues that there have been cycles in history of markets dominating society, and then markets becoming subservient and embedded within society. In this timeline, I illustrate how markets became embedded and disembedded throughout the years. The famous Piketty income inequality graph follows the trend and supports Karl Polanyi's idea of cycles too. Robber barons in the mid-1880s were known as those who put profit for themselves above the good of everyone else. They were the equivalent of modern-day libertarians, corporate raiders, grifters or oligarchs. One example is Philip Palmer, who would slash wages, labour standards and costs to increase efficiency, at the cost of health and safety of workers and consumers. In the mid-1880s, the Supreme Court gave corporations even more power by defining them as persons, by invoking the 14th Amendment, granting corporations the same constitutional rights as citizens. During these times, child labour and exploitation were rampant. The Gilded Age created record inequality between the richest and poorest. This continued until the reforms of Theodore Roosevelt, who began to have a more critical attitude towards corporate dominance in the early 20th century. He broke up monopolies, instituting 44 antitrust suits and putting regulatory controls on companies such as Standard Oil. Next, Franklin D. Roosevelt went even further in the 1930s and 40s by promoting the idea of corporate responsibility and increasing labour laws. Corporations actually had a legal responsibility to the rest of society. People often incorrectly assume that corporate responsibility is something new, or from the 90s, but it was a dominant political idea back as early as the 30s. FDR followed the advice of British economist John Maynard Keynes and ushered in an era, ironically now known as the Golden Age of Capitalism. And so the reforms that began at the start of the 20th century instilled a strong tradition of corporate responsibility and redistributive Keynesian economics. This continued up until the 70s, when a group of investors from the UK entered the scene. Led by Zach Goldsmith, they pioneered the culture of corporate raiders. They would perform hostile takeovers of often family-run businesses and strip them of their assets, fire a large part of their workforce and then sell them on at inflated stock prices. And to this day, when there are layoffs and restructuring, this often causes the stock price to surge. Pension funds were now the most dominant form of capital investments, and the laws surrounding the funds explicitly stated that they had to prioritise the highest return possible. Because they had a fiduciary responsibility, they had to use the unscrupulous practices of the corporate raiders. In the years since the corporate raiders, in what is known as the Neoliberal world, or, as Ronald Reagan called it, the New World Order, the ideology has stripped back many of those worker and consumer rights and protections. Deregulation has been the driving force. There have been countless more reductions in bargaining power and much less investment into the disadvantaged, with austerity and cutbacks affecting most of Europe for more than 4 decades, while bargaining power and welfare has been systematically dismantled in America for even longer since the McCarthy era, now having the least amount of holidays and worker protections than most developed nations. Corporate control over politics tightened even more with the passage of Citizens United in America, a landmark decision of the Supreme Court concerning campaign finance. The court held that the free speech clause of the First Amendment prohibits the government from restricting independent expenditures for political campaigns. This extended political power to private lobbying groups in a similar way that the law granted corporations personhood in the 1880s, on our scale of embedded versus disembedded markets. The cyberpunk universe has accelerated so far that it's gone off the chart. Johnny exists in a morally grey zone. His resistance causes such paranoia of corporate control that it leads him to thinking that almost everything bad that happens is the fault of just one corporation, Arasaka. In 2023, Johnny attacks the Arasaka headquarters to save his friend Alt Cunningham, and in a bid to end the Fourth Corporate War. But there are differences in the backstory shown from the point of view of Johnny's memory of the assault on Arasaka Towers with a mini-nuke, with Johnny making himself out to be more of a hero to himself. As the Cyberpunk fandom wiki says, the creators of the original game confirm this is intentional to show Johnny's narcissistic side. Johnny may even have been manipulated and used so easily because of his ego by Arasaka's main corporate rival, Militech. Militech actually funded and planned the operation to attack Arasaka Towers while fighting alongside Johnny Silverhand. In fact, he may have also contributed to a world where people advocating for workers' rights and higher corporate taxes are seen as terrorists, leading ironically to a situation of increased corporate dominance by 2077. Since the 2008 financial crash, there's also been bigger public pushback demanding policies from people like Jeremy Corbyn and Bernie Sanders. As we have seen during the last time inequality peaked at its highest at the turn of the 20th century, the suppression of that pushback often comes in the form of mobs who smash unions and fascists who spread fear of people who are different and of people who are less fortunate or asking for a more equitable slice of the pie. This movement has been suppressed in large part by the establishment stopping Jeremy Corbyn and Sanders. And recently the anti-lockdown movement clearly being pushed and weaponised by the far right. In the past few years, this type of propaganda has more and more resembled fascist conspiracies from 1930s Nazi Germany. The far right often do the bidding of anti-worker interest groups and lobbies like PragerU and Koch brothers, as shown in this Byline Times article, linked down below. Cyberpunk is what is known as a sandbox game, a simulated world which exists within the constraints of its parameters. Sandbox software development environments are also used for testing simulated scenarios in a safe way without the consequences spilling over into the real world. The analogy of sandboxing capitalism can be used to conceptualize the idea mentioned earlier of market embeddedness, where markets are embedded within the needs of society rather than society working for the needs of markets. This will be achieved not only with tighter regulation and laws that mandate corporate responsibility, but also increasing the amount of the economy made up by socialist enterprises and organisations, thereby giving people actual choices and economic freedom. I find the phrase sandboxing capitalism to be a particularly useful analogy for both conceptualising embedded markets and as a powerful rhetorical tool, and to remind people of the need to keep markets embedded in the future to protect against the risks of unrestrained capitalism. Non-sandbox capitalism even sounds dangerous, and in many ways it is. This would also help new entrepreneurs starting their own businesses with themselves and workers protected more. This could allow creativity to flourish in an environment that invests in their future and maybe a new golden age. Now that Trump has lost the election, there's less chance of institutional support for fascists to repress people's demands for a more equal society. There is even a chance that Joe Biden or his successor could be this generation's FDR by bringing markets and corporations back into the service of society. People seem to forget that FDR and Clement Attlee were both moderate liberals. They responded to the public pressure for change. And in fact, the first President Roosevelt who ran on breaking up monopolies was a Republican, not a Democrat. Moderates like Biden are actually more likely to be able to pass laws through Congress or the House of Lords than those seen as radical like Corbyn or Sanders. You need consensus in politics to make big changes after all. There would of course be a constant threat that capital becomes more powerful again and then removes the reforms, like the neoliberals did in the 70s and 80s to overturn the Keynesian consensus. This is why I think we need a philosophy that explicitly seeks to keep markets sandboxed or embedded. It would hopefully act as a constant reminder of the threat of capital against labour in the future. This dystopian future, as imagined in the world of Cyberpunk, is a cautionary tale that takes on greater significance each day. We can choose to act now or face a reality where massive amounts of the world are uninhabitable. In the Cyberpunk future, 20% of the continent is no longer habitable, with the news constantly reporting on natural disasters from the fallout. There's even a scene where you visit an underwater city consumed by the rising sea levels. I don't think that just giving people more democratic control of their workplace will magically solve climate change, and neither will regulation alone. But having the people affected by the outcomes closer to the decision-making process would incentivise them to choose decisions that align with the needs of the rest of society much better. Combined with top-down regulations, a new culture of corporate responsibility and rebuilding of the welfare state, and also a bottom-up culture that promotes networks of public pressure, unions, mutual aid, and worker and consumer ownership, such as cooperative workplaces and housing. Viewed through the lens of embedded versus disembedded markets, the choice we face is that of the following: grafters versus grifters, reciprocal trade versus exploitative, Keynesian economics versus neoliberal economics, corporate responsibility versus robber barons, politicians working for the people versus working for corporate interests, regulations and controls versus laissez-faire free markets, targeting full employment versus targeting lower taxes, a competitive jobs market for workers versus a competitive labour market for employers, a culture that helps the poorest to succeed versus a culture of nihilism, greed and exploitation. As shown in episode 3 of Adam Curtis's brilliant history of the corporate takeover, pension funds, set up as a form of collective insurance in old age, which replaced living state pensions, became the very thing that ends up oppressing workers during the working years. But ironically, in the Cyberpunk universe, it's said that when the collapse hit, it was the elderly that were hit first. The millions of Americans who lived on pensions and investments, the work and savings of their entire lives evaporated. Being anti-capitalist isn't necessarily being pro-worker.
You forgot your guitar!
No, I didn't. Haven't forgotten a thing. Never will.
I think the choice we face is not between radical direct action versus liberal reform. We must do both, building dual power structures of both political state power to harness regulation and social power structures like mutual aid and media that inspires and renews the cultural motivation. The Cyberpunk game and the cultural aesthetic is alluring, and it conveys powerful messages and warnings for us all. We ignore them at our own risk. Speaking of mutual aid, I have to give a huge heartfelt shout out to everyone who helped me pay my rent last month. Also, a huge shout out to my top Patreon subscriber, Joe, and all the other amazing people who've helped me recently. If you enjoyed this, please check out my Patreon, and consider supporting me to help me create more content like this.
That's fine, however, I'm just like, let's put down that long, dope, dark-ass verse to let motherfuckers know this shit is real.
Everybody knows things are bad. It's a depression. Everybody's out of work or scared of losing their job. The dollar buys a nickel's worth. Banks are going bust. Shopkeepers keep a gun under the counter. Punks are running wild on the street. There's nobody anywhere who seems to know what to do, and there's no end to it. We know the air is unfit to breathe. Our food is unfit to eat. We sit watching our TVs while some local newscaster tells us that today we had 15 homicides and 63 violent crimes, as if that's the way it's supposed to be. We know things are bad, worse than bad. They're crazy. It's like everything everywhere is going crazy, so we don't go out anymore. We sit in the house, and slowly the world we're living in is getting smaller, and all we say is, please, at least leave us alone in our living rooms. Let me have my toaster and my TV and my steel-belted radios, and I won't say anything. Just leave us alone. Well, I'm not going to leave you alone. I want you to get mad. I want you to protest. I don't want you to riot. I don't want you to write to your congressman because I wouldn't know what to tell you to write. I don't know what to do about the depression and the inflation and the Russians and the crime in the street. All I know is that first, you've got to get mad. You've got to say, I'm a human being. God damn it. My life has value.
Picture this, I'm a bag of dicks, put me to your lips, I am sick, I will punch a baby bear in his shit, give me lip, I'ma send you to the yard, get a stick, make a switch, I can end the conversation real quick.
I am crack, I ain't lying, kick a lion in this crack, I'm the shit. I will fall off in your crib, take a shit, hit your mama on the booty, kick your dog, fuck your bitch. That boy dressed up like he sat on and took pictures with your kids.
We the best, we will cut a funny face in your chest, little wench, I'm unmentionably fresh, I'm a mensch, yeah correct, I will walk into a court while they wreck, screaming yes, I am guilty motherfuckers, I am death. Hey, you wanna hear a good joke?
Nobody speak, nobody get choked.